It was that sort of attitude. I mean, he would get his protection officers to drive some of these females home. And to be quite honest with you, last time.
There was no warning bell, no formal announcement, no line of cameras outside the gates to tell the country that something inside the royal world had shifted. And yet, behind the guarded entrance of the palace, in one of those moments that seem small until history gives it weight, Queen Camilla was left staring at a truth she could neither command nor ignore. Her guests had arrived, expecting to be welcomed under her authority. Instead, royal guards stopped them at the entrance and refused them entry. In that single act, cold, procedural, and impossible to misread, the palace sent a message far more serious than a social insult. It was a signal about power, about limits, and about who truly controlled the royal household when the doors closed. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss a single update. Because this was not simply a misunderstanding over names on a list. It was not a delay caused by security traffic or some harmless confusion between offices. It was something far more delicate. Camilla had extended an invitation. The guests believed they were entering on her word. Yet the guards at the gate, men trained not to speculate and never to improvise around royal procedure, told them they did not have authorization to proceed. That mattered, because palace entry is not merely about hospitality. It is about rank, chain of command, and institutional recognition. In royal life, a guest list is not just a list. It is an expression of who has standing, who has approval, and who is acting with the knowledge of the household. Those few minutes at the gate created panic, not because of embarrassment alone, but because of what they suggested. If Camilla's guests could be turned away under the eyes of the palace, then someone, somewhere, had either overruled her, blocked her, or decided that her personal authority no longer extended as far as she believed. The country saw one image later, through whispers and reports: a tense scene, startled faces, cars waiting, staff moving quickly. Inside the family, the truth was far more painful. What looked like a security refusal was heard inside palace walls, as a question no one wanted asked aloud. Had Camilla's position been quietly narrowed without her consent? The silence that followed was telling. No one rushed to explain. No senior aide immediately appeared with a reassuring smile. No corrected instruction came through in time to spare her the humiliation. And in the monarchy, delay has meaning. A palace that wants confusion cleared can clear it in moments. A palace that stays silent is often allowing a lesson to land. Camilla, by all accounts, was shaken. Not outwardly in the way ordinary people imagine panic, with raised voices and visible distress. Royal panic is different. It is colder. It shows in the stillness of the face, in the sudden tightening of the mouth, in the refusal to move until someone gives an answer worthy of the moment. She had expected deference. She had not expected resistance. She had expected the matter to be corrected quietly. She had not expected the refusal to remain in place long enough for the insult to become real. What made it worse was the setting. Palaces are built on ritual, and ritual survives by eliminating uncertainty. Doors open for the right people. Cars are expected. Names are cleared. Guards know the order before the guests arrive. When that order fails in front of someone at Camilla's level, it does not feel like administrative error. It feels like institutional distance. It feels deliberate, even when no one dares use that word. And yet, to understand why this moment struck with such force, we have to step away from the gate itself. The story did not begin there. The decision, if decision is the right word, was not born that morning. It began much earlier, in a season of strain the public could sense, but not fully measure, when the monarchy was trying to protect the image of unity while quietly reorganizing the realities of power behind the curtains. By then, every corridor of the palace had become more sensitive than before. King Charles was still the sovereign, still the center of state duty, still the figure to whom authority ultimately returned. But the pressures around him had changed the atmosphere of the institution. The royal household was not simply arranging engagements and ceremonial appearances. It was thinking about continuity, stability, and the management of perception. Continuity meant the monarchy's ability to function without visible fracture. Stability meant the public had to believe the family remained aligned, even when private tensions deepened. And perception, perhaps most importantly, meant that every room, every invitation, every seating plan, every public encounter had begun to carry more weight than it once did. This is where the hidden tension around Camilla had been growing. She was queen, yes. She had stood beside Charles through years of controversy, rehabilitation, and eventual recognition. She had earned a place that, for a long time, many thought she never could. But acceptance inside a monarchy is rarely total. It can be ceremonial without being emotional. It can be constitutional without being personal. It can exist on paper and still remain fragile in practice. As Charles leaned more heavily on senior structures around him, advisors became more cautious about informal influence. They were not only managing the present, they were looking toward the future. Prince William's increasing visibility, Catherine's symbolic importance, the public's sensitivity to succession, and the institution's fear of competing power centers all forced the palace into a more defensive posture. The monarchy could survive criticism. It could survive scandal, but it believed it could not survive blurred authority at the top. And that was the deeper issue. Camilla had a role, but how far did that role extend when personal relationships, social loyalties, and palace access intersected? Could her private network move freely through royal space simply because she wished it? Or did every movement now need to pass through a harder layer of control, one designed not to disrespect her, but to define her? That question became sharper after an earlier incident, one few outside the palace understood at the time. It happened during a private gathering linked to a charitable and cultural reception, the kind of event that often appears harmless to the public but is treated with enormous sensitivity inside royal operations. Several attendees had not been part of the core planning matrix prepared by the Central Household Office. That office, formal and deeply procedural, exists to ensure royal spaces remain aligned with the sovereign's priorities. The official household was not a social convenience. It was the administrative engine that protected the monarchy from exactly the kind of ambiguity that could later become a crisis. On that earlier occasion, there had been whispers among staff that certain guests were present, more by Camilla's preference than by institutional clearance. No one made a public issue of it. No one wanted embarrassment, but the discomfort registered. Some senior aides worried that palace rooms were beginning to host circles not fully accountable to the central system. Others feared that private access could be mistaken for official influence. And in a monarchy, the difference between those two things is everything. A private guest may be welcome. An apparently sanctioned court presence is something else entirely. That incident did not explode into scandal. It did something more dangerous. It gave cautious people a reason to start taking notes. And once a palace begins taking notes, procedures follow. In the weeks that came after, new layers of review quietly appeared. Entry protocols were tightened. Invitations associated with certain residences or private gatherings began requiring additional confirmation. The reason given, when reason was given at all, was security modernization. Security, in royal language, is often the perfect cover for broader institutional correction. It sounds neutral. It sounds responsible. It sounds like no one is being targeted. Yet the practical effect can be very personal. Camilla may have sensed this shift without fully grasping how far it had advanced. That is often how palace power works. Nothing is announced directly. No one says, "Your range has narrowed." No one sends a letter declaring, "From this point onward, your discretion will be limited." Instead, doors begin to answer differently. Staff become more careful. Requests take longer. Informal assumptions stop working. The room does not accuse you. It simply stops moving at your pace. There were signs. A dinner arrangement altered at the last minute. A preferred attendee moved to a secondary list. A briefing adjusted without her office being fully consulted. Each incident could be explained away. Each one was small enough to deny. But together, they formed a pattern. The truth was more painful because it was never spoken in full. Camilla was beginning to encounter not rebellion, but containment. No one raised their voice, but the mood inside the palace hardened. Then came the confrontation no one outside the family saw. It is said to have taken place after one particularly tense review of household operations, when Charles, already carrying the strain of monarchy and mortality, was confronted with the growing friction between his wife's expectations and the system's new caution. He had expected concern. He had not expected anger. Camilla, by then, was no longer speaking about minor inconveniences. She was speaking about dignity, about trust, about whether she was to be treated as a central figure or as a ceremonial spouse whose reach ended where others decided. Charles listened, and that mattered. He always knew better than most that humiliation inside a palace can wound more deeply than open argument. But he also understood something Camilla did not wish to hear. The monarchy was entering a phase where informal accommodation would no longer be enough. The sovereign's household was preparing itself against uncertainty. That meant more discipline, more hierarchy, fewer private assumptions, less room for overlapping personal authority. He did not frame it as a rebuke. He framed it as necessity. But necessity is one of the cruelest words in royal life. It can justify almost any coldness. Camilla's response, if accounts are to be believed, was not theatrical. It was sharper than that. She is said to have asked a question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. If her judgment could not be trusted at the door, then what exactly was the meaning of her position inside the palace at all? That was the wound. Not the guests, not the optics, the meaning. Charles could not answer in the way a husband might. He had to answer as king. And that is where these family dramas become so painful, because the monarchy does not permit its leading figures to remain only one thing. A husband is also sovereign, a son is also heir, a sister is also counselor of state. Every feeling must pass through office before it can become action. He told her, in essence, that the institution was not moving against her, it was moving for itself. That should have comforted her. Instead, it made the truth unmistakable. Because when an institution moves for itself, even the people closest to the throne can feel expendable. The days after that conversation were marked by a tension that even experienced staff found difficult to ignore. Camilla's office reportedly pressed for clarification. Lists were reviewed. Chains of authorization were revisited. Security officials, who prefer precision over palace emotion, pointed to procedure. Procedure meant the authorized names on the cleared registry. Procedure meant the sovereign's approved operational envelope. Procedure meant that no matter who had made the social invitation, final access to protected royal space depended on the household command system. A state residence is not a private drawing room. That distinction mattered now more than ever. Some in the palace believed the matter would fade, but it did not, because humiliation, once felt, begins searching for explanation, and explanation, once demanded, begins exposing old resentments. There were those around William who had long believed the monarchy needed cleaner lines ahead of the future transition. Succession, in simple terms, is the process by which the crown passes in continuity from one sovereign to the next. But succession planning begins long before the crown changes heads. It shapes visibility, access, symbolism, and trust. William represented the future reign. Catherine represented the image through which much of that future would be accepted. Any uncertainty around who could influence palace atmosphere, private circles, or ceremonial access was therefore viewed by some as more than a domestic issue. It was a risk to coherence. That did not mean William was directing anything personally. It meant the world around him was already thinking in terms of the reign to come. And in that world, ambiguous authority looked dangerous. The silence deepened between the households. Not openly, not in a way the public could see. Appearances remained composed. Meetings were still held. Public duties continued. Yet beneath the choreography, a harder truth was settling into place. The monarchy was beginning to separate affection from function. Camilla felt that separation more than most, because her entire royal existence had depended on the slow merging of those two things. She had become accepted through endurance, loyalty, and the passage of time. She stood beside Charles not because the road had been easy, but because they had survived what many thought unsalvageable. For that reason, any attempt to reduce her practical standing felt to her like a rewriting of the very bargain through which she had entered royal legitimacy. And then came the day of the refusal. Her guests approached under the assumption that all was settled. Cars moved toward the palace. Names had been conveyed. Staff expected a routine reception. But somewhere between invitation and entry, the hard edge of the new system asserted itself. The guards were not rude. They were firm. Royal guards are trained to embody discipline, not drama. They did not invent reasons. They did not negotiate feelings. They informed the arriving party that authorization had not been granted and that entry could not be permitted. At first, there was disbelief. Surely there had been some minor clerical failure. Surely someone would call ahead. Surely a queen's guests were not about to stand outside a palace gate as though they had approached the wrong door. But the minutes passed. Phones were used. Messages moved. Aides hurried. And still, the barrier remained. That was the moment panic took hold. Not because Camilla feared a newspaper line, not yet. Panic came because she understood at once what this scene meant inside the palace, even if no camera ever captured it. She had been put in the position of appearing unable to deliver access to the very institution she helped represent. Her social word had collided with the household's operational word, and the household had won. There is a cruelty in official refusal when it arrives in public silence. No one says you were wrong. The system simply behaves as though your expectation never mattered. Witnesses later described a mood of shock among those nearby. Staff who normally moved with polished ease were suddenly divided between sympathy and caution. Some wanted to resolve the matter quickly to preserve dignity. Others knew that overriding security on the spot would only confirm the very looseness the new rules were designed to stop. The result was paralysis. In royal settings, paralysis is often where truth becomes visible. Camilla is said to have demanded an explanation. Not loudly, not in a scene of spectacle, but with that unmistakable royal frost that makes everyone in the room suddenly aware that something has broken. She wanted to know who had blocked the clearance, why her office had not been informed, and on whose authority the refusal stood. These were not social questions. They were constitutional questions in miniature, because they all pointed toward one thing. Where was power now resting when her own instructions could be denied? The answers did not come quickly, and their delay only deepened the insult. Eventually, the language began to emerge. Security review, unconfirmed authorization, residence protocols. None of it satisfied her because all of it pointed away from personality and toward system. You can argue with a person. You cannot easily argue with a process, especially when that process claims to protect the crown. By late afternoon, the palace had entered full damage control mode. Senior aides were brought in. Internal messages were compared. The Lord Chamberlain's circle, a central part of ceremonial and household order, was said to have been made aware. The Lord Chamberlain, though little understood outside royal circles, is a senior officer responsible for aspects of court administration and ceremonial structure. When such offices become involved, a matter has already moved beyond embarrassment. It has become institutional. Charles, when informed of the full scene, reportedly reacted with visible heaviness. This was not the kind of crisis a king wants. It did not threaten government. It did not shake markets. But it struck at the emotional stability of his household and touched the most dangerous royal nerve of all, the gap between public role and private trust. He understood what others did too. If the story escaped the walls, it would not remain a technical dispute. It would become a symbol, and symbols are what monarchy lives or dies by. Because the public would not hear, guards followed updated protocol. The public would hear, Camilla's guests were turned away from the palace. The public would ask the simplest question with the sharpest edge, turned away by whom? Once that question entered the air, the possible meanings multiplied. Was Camilla being sidelined? Was there division between her and the central household? Was the palace quietly redefining her place in anticipation of a future order centered more clearly on William and Catherine? Was Charles allowing a narrowing of her influence to stabilize the line of succession? None of those interpretations needed to be confirmed to become dangerous. Royal crises do not begin when facts are proven. They begin when symbols become believable. And believable this was. By evening, the first whispers had spread beyond the palace gates. A staff member told a friend. A driver repeated what had been overheard. A reporter caught the outline of something strange. The language shifted as it always does in the early life of a royal drama. A mix-up became a refusal. A refusal became a blockade. A blocked guest list became a sign of panic. Before long, the wider public mood was not asking whether the moment had occurred, but what it revealed. Broadcasters did not need to interrupt programming for the nation to feel the tremor. The modern palace crisis spreads differently now. It moves through speculation, commentary, unnamed insiders, and that peculiar form of national attention that gathers when a private family wound seems to expose the machinery of the crown. Newspapers prepared their angles. Royal watchers argued over hierarchy. Supporters of Camilla called it disrespect. Critics said it showed the limits of unelected influence inside a constitutional monarchy. And everywhere beneath the noise was one larger fear. If this could happen at the palace door, what else was changing behind the walls? Inside the family, the pain was more intimate. Camilla was not merely furious. She was hurt. That difference matters. Fury seeks victory. Hurt seeks recognition. She had stood through storms, through public memory, through years of judgment and slow rehabilitation. She had accepted burdens that once seemed impossible. To be diminished now, not by protest crowds or tabloids, but by the palace's own internal hand, felt to her like a betrayal by the only structure that could make her position meaningful. Yet those around Charles saw another truth. The king was not choosing cruelty. He was trapped between attachment and architecture. The monarchy had entered a season where every informal liberty risked being interpreted as a competing channel of influence. Advisors feared confusion. Security feared inconsistency. Future planners feared precedent. In trying to secure the house, they had humiliated someone inside it. This was not an argument about a guest list. It was a collision between love and system. Another private confrontation followed, and by then the emotional stakes were impossible to hide. It is said Camilla asked Charles directly whether he still expected her to carry the burdens of rank while accepting the restrictions of an outsider. It was a brutal question because it contained the answer she feared. Charles, weary and deeply conscious of the cost of every word, is said to have told her that no one was pushing her out, but that the monarchy could no longer afford blurred channels at the top. He spoke of discipline, continuity, and the need for one chain of authority over palace space. She heard one thing only, that affection would not protect her from administrative reduction. No one raised their voice, but the distance between them grew for a moment large enough to feel historical. That is how royal marriages are tested. Not in scandalous scenes alone, but in those quiet rooms where one person pleads for personal recognition and the other can answer only in the language of duty. In the aftermath, a form of settlement began to take shape. Not a public settlement, not a declaration, a palace settlement. These are the arrangements by which tensions are cooled without anyone being allowed to claim defeat. Camilla's office would receive clearer procedural briefings. Certain categories of private guests would require earlier verification. Access tied to personal invitations would be reviewed against residence protocol. In plain terms, the palace would pretend to offer clarity while actually cementing control. That was the compromise. And it was painful precisely because it was so polished. The public eventually sensed enough to know that something significant had taken place. The palace did what palaces do. It avoided theatrical denial while offering the faint outline of order. No dramatic statement was issued. No open feud was acknowledged. But when an institution refuses to kill a story outright, it often does so because the core of it is too sensitive to touch. Crowds outside the royal residences in the following days looked for signs in every appearance. Did Camilla seem strained? Did Charles look tired? Was William more visible? Was Catherine's calm presence now carrying even greater symbolic weight? The nation debated without full evidence, because monarchy invites interpretation. It always has. A glance becomes a message. A seating arrangement becomes a forecast. A gate refusal becomes a chapter in the struggle over who belongs at the center when the future is already pressing on the present. And William's shadow over the story, though indirect, became impossible to ignore. He did not need to intervene. His very position as heir altered the meaning of everything. The present reign still stood, yet the future reign had begun shaping the heir. That is one of the most painful truths in monarchy. The future arrives before the present is ready to release it. Charles remained king, but the system around him increasingly behaved like a machine, aware of what comes next. Any figure not seamlessly aligned with that next chapter would inevitably feel the narrowing. Camilla understood that now with painful clarity. This was not exile. It was something quieter and, in some ways, harder to fight. Exile is visible. Exile creates sympathy. What she faced was adjustment without confession, role without full discretion, status without unlimited reach, respect perhaps, but increasingly bounded respect. Yet the monarchy could not simply cast her aside, nor did it truly wish to. She remained central to Charles's emotional life and to the public image of his reign. Removing her would not restore order. It would create a deeper fracture. So the palace chose the path it often chooses when trapped between truth and appearance. It reduced through procedure while maintaining through symbolism. That is why the final scenes after such a crisis matter so much. A few days later, when the family appeared again within public view, royal watchers searched every movement for meaning. Charles and Camilla were seen together, close enough to show solidarity, formal enough to preserve distance. William's own presence elsewhere carried its own message of continuity. Catherine, serene and composed, seemed once again to embody the future without needing to name it. Nothing was said openly. Everything was understood partially. That is how monarchy speaks when it cannot afford direct language. But the most powerful image came not from the public line, but from a quieter moment afterward. As the official business of the day ended and cameras lost access, Camilla is said to have taken Charles's arm, not with triumph, not with theatrical grace, but with the subdued dignity of someone who had learned a cruel lesson and chosen, for now, not to turn it into open war. He, in turn, did not withdraw. He let the gesture stand. It was small, yet it carried the full sorrow of the story. Because in that single movement lay the truth of the crisis. The family remained together, but not untouched. The institution remained intact, but not innocent. The palace had protected its lines, but only by wounding one of its own most visible figures. Love had not ended. Duty had not failed, but the two could no longer remain in exactly the same form. And that may be the real meaning of this entire episode. The guards at the gate did more than stop a group of guests. They revealed that the monarchy is now living in a state of painful preparation. Preparation over improvisation. Preparation over sentiment. Preparation over the old belief that proximity to the sovereign automatically grants freedom of movement through the royal machine. The future was being acknowledged without being declared. The present was being defended without being fully trusted. And in the space between those two realities stood Camilla, feeling for a moment the cold edge of a palace that had chosen order over comfort. The country saw one thing. Inside the family, the truth was far more painful. It was not about a door alone. It was about who can open one. It was not about guests alone. It was about who counts as authorized by the institution itself. It was not about social embarrassment. It was about whether affection, marriage, and years of loyalty could still hold their ground when the monarchy tightened itself for the years ahead. In the end, the palace did what the palace always tries to do. It survived the scene. It absorbed the humiliation. It turned conflict into procedure and pain into silence. But silence does not erase meaning. It preserves it. And so the image remains, a queen in shock, guests halted, guards unmoved, aides unsettled, a king burdened, and a monarchy, reminding everyone within its walls that no bond, however intimate, stands entirely above the institution it serves. That is what made the moment so devastating. That is what made it feel larger than a simple refusal. The monarchy chose preparation over ease. It chose clarity over comfort. And in doing so, it exposed the private cost of preserving the crown. Thanks for watching. Please do not forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.